The Forsaken expansion for Destiny 2 came out one day after I released my Machinima project Shatterproof on the 4th of September 2018. Given the fact that Forsaken was a gargantuan expansion and I spent almost all of my free time playing Destiny back in those days, I ended up playing Destiny 2 for about 1 or 2 weeks straight with essentially zero other interests, least of all Machinima. But when the Forsaken content dried up, I started working my next project, Phoenix Rising, the tale of Osiris and Saint 14, and the bitter ideological differences that led to the former's exile. For every Machinima project I've ever done, I always have the scripts prepared ahead of time. I wrote the script for Shatterproof while shooting Corruption, and I wrote the script for Phoenix Rising while shooting Shatterproof. I work this way for 3 reasons. Firstly, to fill up the spare time in between shooting and editing and waiting for voice lines. Secondly, to give me enough time to fully develop and polish the script so that there's not a single line out of place. And thirdly, so I can hit the ground running and start to put out a casting call for my new project within a day or 2 of the old one being uploaded. Obviously, with Forsaken in the picture, I was not as hit the ground running as I usually am, but I still managed to cast Phoenix Rising fairly quickly. The important point here is the time for development and polishing, because I spent a lot of the summer of 2018 toying with and reshaping the plot. I had a few base elements that I needed to get in, all of them referenced heavily in the lore, but as with Shatterproof there was not a lot of verbatim dialogue for me to lean on. Only Saint 14's fight with the Kill near the end is lifted directly from a Grimoire card. The first thing I needed to include was the Battle of Twilight Gap. The second was Osiris' exile. The third thing was the aforementioned Grimoire card, and the fourth thing was the lore tab for Saint 14's Grey Pigeon, where he sends out a farewell message knowing that his ship will make it back but he won't. This kind of gave me a loose structure for the plot. Since the initial concept of the project was an exploration of the early days of the city, and since Osiris was so pivotal in that, it made sense to make him the lead character. This naturally led on to the conflict between Osiris and the Speaker, which leads to Osiris' exile. As a Grimoire legend in his own right, and as an ideological opponent to Osiris, as depicted by the comics, it made sense then to make Saint 14 as a secondary lead character. Phoenix Rising is ultimately about their relationship and what they represent. And that's what's different about Phoenix Rising from all my previous projects, the introduction of themes and ideas. There are intellectual undercurrents to Phoenix Rising, questions about authority, about religion, about knowledge, and about isolationism. Of course, these are only just undercurrents, and Phoenix Rising is no political masterpiece, but the fact that these elements exist, even in their most rudimentary and basic form, was a big step forward for me. My previous projects all had plot and characters, but they were never really about anything, they were always just stories. Phoenix Rising has an extra element of depth to that, largely as a result of the characterisation in the script. Talking of the script, it went through numerous rewrites, more so than any other script I've ever written. I struggled to plot out the basic order of the scenes, often rearranging sequences. In contrast, the dialogue came very easily to me. This, I think, was because a lot of the conversations don't feel like the kind of plot advancing exposition I'd been so prone to churning out up until that point. If you go through and look at all the discussions between Saint 14 and Osiris, the actual plot mechanisms only go on for a couple of lines maximum. The rest of it is always Osiris and Saint 14 bickering, really. Their dialogue is very sort of back and forwards, and I had a lot of fun writing Osiris in particular because he's very sarcastic and very snappy. Saint 14 is more stoic, and again this level of contrast and characterisation was more complex than anything I'd written before. Saint 14 and Osiris feel like fully fleshed out and well-rounded characters for the most part, and they have a complicated relationship with each other. Talking of said relationship, I was at that time unaware of the trend in the Destiny community towards shipping Osiris and Saint 14. And please bear in mind that I am writing Phoenix Rising during the summer of 2018. This was before Saint 14 made his canonical reappearance, and it was before the two characters were canonically confirmed to be gay, so all that existed was subtext and fanfiction. Which is not nothing, but it's hardly the concrete obviousness that characterised, say, Eriana 3 and Wei Ning's relationship, which I did purposefully depict as romantic in Infinity, although I definitely should have done more to make that explicit. Anyways, the point here is this. I wrote Phoenix Rising before any of this was really cemented, but even back then I had an understanding that this might be read and interpreted in certain ways. I deliberately avoided denying that Osiris and Saint 14 had any feelings for each other, but I inadvertently wrote them in a way that set them up as opponents who were not particularly fond of each other. This fitted well with the themes and ideas that I was trying to explore, and it was mostly accurate to the lore, but frankly, I wish I'd written Phoenix Rising with more homoerotic tension in it. If nothing else, it would have raised the dramatic stakes, it would have made Saint 14's death more impactful, and it would have created a quieter and slightly more intimate tone. Speaking of dramatic stakes, I added in the Lysander subplot for two reasons. To give the plot something to do after the Battle of Twilight Gap, and also to create a real, credible, tangible threat to the city that Osiris has to stop, something that went beyond just the speaker's rhetoric. The fact that Lysander played perfectly into the political aspects of Phoenix Rising was just icing on the cake, really. Very little information is actually given in the Grimoire about Lysander, except that he was the leader of the Concordat, so I kept things short and simple. The Concordat were trying to destroy the city, the new monarchy would defeat the Concordat, and then Osiris would foil Lysander's last-ditch effort to blow up the speaker. I scripted Lysander to be completely insane, with an almost sort of parodic libertarian justification for destroying the city. Ultimately, he goes down pretty quickly and he's not really intended to be the main villain. Panoptes, who's only introduced towards the end of the film and even then only in dialogue, isn't really the main villain either. There is no main villain of Phoenix Rising. In fact, part of the reason I like it so much is that it doesn't have a set, predictable structure. With regards to extended projects like films and series, Destiny Machinima, and to a slightly lesser extent Machinima in general, tends to heavily derive their tones and plot structures from the superhero genre, with the influence of the MCU especially apparent. Phoenix Rising bucks that trend by not really subscribing to these tropes, which was new for me. All of my previous projects had, if not a clear singular villain like Dredge and Yor, then at least an enemy faction, like Crota's Hive or the Vex in the Vault of Glass. I really enjoyed writing Phoenix Rising because it gave me the chance to focus down on the characterisation and sharpen the dialogue, instead of having to worry about convoluted plot machinations. For the most part, the shoot for Phoenix Rising was really very simple. A lot of it is discussion scenes, which are always very easy to shoot. The most challenging part of shooting discussion scenes is trying to find different and interesting shots and angles to reduce the visual monotony of a long back and forth dialogue. However, a couple of scenes were a little tricky to nail down. The combat scenes at the beginning were shot in story missions and were quite annoying but generally manageable. The Concordat versus New Monarchy battle took significantly more finesse to pull off. For starters, it required, briefly, 4 people on screen. By this point, for shooting, I was using Daniel's Xbox alongside my own so I could have his Xbox on camera duties, which would leave me free to body act characters in my Xbox. However, that still left 3 other body actors required, which brings me on to my next point. There are 2 scenes in Phoenix Rising that caused me a lot of headaches because of the amount of people that I needed. One of them was the Concordat versus New Monarchy duel, and the other one was Six Fronts. Now, I'd scripted Six Fronts in a slightly unusual way, having a character of my own creation, Theus, deliver a monologue that was originally delivered by Shaxx in Destiny 2. This had the advantage of not really tethering me to specific visual actions. I could kind of sort of play it by eye, so to speak, when it came time to shoot. This worked in my favour because on one particular Friday night I had by some miracle managed to get 5 other body actors to help me shoot the Six Front scene, and it was there and then that I decided what it would look like visually. I didn't really plan any of the shots that you can see in front of you beforehand. I just lucked out with the number of people who were willing to help out and I wanted to make the most of it, so I shot enough footage for the entire monologue completely on the fly. The fact that it was a monologue meant I could just crossfade a lot of the clips into each other, so as long as each shot went on for a good while, I didn't really need to worry about continuity or timing the length of each shot. What I did do though was ensure that I had a female Sunbreaker to stand in as Lu Feng. Phoenix Rising was the first project in which I shot to my script, which meant that I was actually checking the script as I was shooting and keeping a mental tally of what I still needed to do, as opposed to what I did in Corruption and Crota's Bane, which was shoot random amounts of footage and hope that it was enough. For Shatterproof, I'd read the script before each shoot, but that still sometimes left me having to go back and do insert shots and retakes. With Phoenix Rising, there was none of that. This also meant that each discussion scene had exactly the right number of shots recorded. Because characters' heads still don't move when they talk, you can realistically put most voice lines over most shots and have it mostly work out. So my strategy for filming discussion scenes pre-Phoenix Rising was largely just to get a bunch of different shots of however many people were talking, as opposed to actually working my way through each line of script like I did with Phoenix. The chaos of Six Fronts aside, more people always means more silly antics and more setup time, usually because people accidentally or not so accidentally keep killing each other. Aside from that, the rest of the shoot went very smoothly and I never really ran into any problems at all. Much like Shatterproof and every subsequent project, the casting call for Phoenix Rising was put out online just after the release of Shatterproof. It technically was a week later, but I'd spent the week playing Forsaken, so it actually wasn't too much of a delay. Most of the roles were cast quickly and easily, but there were a few special cases. The first of these was Uros. I'd had a voice actor in mind for her who readily agreed to take on the role. Because we knew each other, I decided to record the voice lines live over Xbox Party Chat, rather than having the actor send in the lines via email. This has the advantage of being faster in most circumstances. It has the disadvantage of sounding atrocious. Even microphones that would normally sound good are reduced to muffled garbage because Xbox compresses the audio down massively, and most people who play games recreationally use affordable headsets that don't have brilliant mics to begin with. I don't think it was necessarily a mistake to record those lines live because it was good experience and it helped me hone my skills working with actors in a live setting, but in terms of audio quality, it definitely wasn't the best. Recording live also means you have a lot more audio to edit down because you have to trim out all the natural talking and retakes that comes with doing lines live. Aside from Uros, the only other character who gave me issues was Lysander. I'd had a few auditions for him, but none of them really captured the kind of deranged hysteria I was looking for. So, I decided to voice him myself. My equipment at that time was also terrible because I only had a cheap USB mic and I wasn't a very self-confident voice actor because I hated the way my voice sounded. So I ended up voicing Lysander in a very hissing, snarling, over-the-top way, both to highlight how villainous and crazy he is, and also to disguise any trace of what my normal speaking voice actually sounds like. It worked to a certain degree, although the sheer excess of my performance can be unintentionally funny sometimes. As for the editing, this was done in roughly the same fashion as my previous projects. The only difference was that I'd split the film up into 3 acts, which meant I had to render each scene twice. The music, as per every project from Shatterproof onwards, was a mixture of video game soundtracks, mostly Destiny, but with others thrown in as well. I was markedly more efficient at editing Phoenix Rising than my previous projects, for 2 reasons. Firstly, I'd gotten progressively faster at editing in general as I'd learned to kind of think through my edits as I was cutting the scene, plus I was well used to dealing with Windows Movie Maker's irritating idiosyncrasies by that point. Secondly, I'd created a shooting schedule with all the scenes listed and split into acts. This allowed me to keep track of what voice lines I'd received, what scenes I'd shot, and what scenes I'd edited and rendered. This meant that there was no going back to shoot insert shots or pickups at the last minute, and it also meant that each scene was shot in a much faster and more linear fashion. This is the first of these little behind the scenes videos where I've touched on talking about not just how I made Machinima on a technical level, but about some of the ideas that went behind it, specifically with regards to the scripts. The thin undercurrent of politics in Phoenix Rising is probably the element I'm most proud of in it, that and the convincing and strong characterisation. Phoenix Rising is still my favourite of all the Destiny 1 machinimas I've made, mostly because of its unusual structure, the fact that I like the script, and the lack of glaringly obvious technical faults, although that's not to say it's perfect in that regard. The character of Osiris became one of the key figures in Infinity, and Phoenix Rising very neatly lays the groundwork for a lot of what happens in Season 1. It was the last machinima I ever made in Destiny 1, and I feel like it's both a fitting send-off to that world, and a forward-looking piece of work that sets up the future of what I would go on to make.